Hello and welcome back to part 2 of The Witch, the Wizards and the Sea Serpent, the final story in From Allbyon to Britannia, Book 1, The Witches of Old Allbyon. So if you haven't listened to part 1 of this story, I suggest you go back and do so. Otherwise, let's see what happens. Where are the wizards and how will they find them? The next morning she walked back down to the monastery to find that the abbot had a visitor. She could feel the magic in him and knew he was a wizard. She curtsied to him and he nodded back, both being polite but not necessarily friendly, and they introduced themselves. His name was Alaric Price. He had felt something happen in the magical atmosphere of the area and had come to St. Michael's to ask if anyone knew of anything. "Well, I might have something useful to tell you," she said. The abbot looked hopeful and the wizard looked sceptical, but she carried on. She showed them the sea serpent scale, explained about scrying with her mirror, and then told them what she had seen. At first she could see that the wizard was not taking her seriously, but then she described the oily green cloud full of numbers. He suddenly took notice and asked her to describe what she had seen again. "A monstrous spell," he said, looking really worried. "What do you mean by monstrous?" asked the abbot. "Like a chimera is a mixture of animals, a monstrous spell is a mixture of the spells of different wizards. From what I know of Hadrian and Selwyn, it sounds to me that it is a mixture of their very different kinds of magic." "So they were working together. What were they trying to do?" the abbot asked. "I assume they were trying to do something about the sea serpent," said the wizard. "The sound immediately before the cloud appeared, it was definitely two separate whistling sounds," said Josephine. "I don't think they were working together at all. I think Wizard Hadrian was trying to make the sea beast small, and Wizard Selwyn was trying to make her change shape. Their spells came together with a bang." "And made a monstrous spell," said the abbot. "Indeed," cried the wizard. "And when the spells collided, they mixed and bounced back to where they had come from." "Apart from the small piece of the mixed spell that hit the sea serpent's crest," Josephine added. "So what has happened to the wizards in their towers?" asked the abbot. Wizard Alaric shrugged. "Monstrous spells are notoriously unpredictable." "Could they have destroyed one another?" said the abbot anxiously. "I have no idea," said the wizard. "We're going to have to go and look, aren't we?" said Josephine. "Mistress Josephine," said the wizard solemnly, "I must apologize to you. I entirely underestimated your powers. I would suggest that you and the abbot visit one site, and I will visit the other. If we ride quickly, we could be back by nightfall." "Might I make a suggestion?" said the abbot. "I have a magnifying glass that was made for me to look at flowers. It might prove useful, though I'm afraid I only have one." "If you will permit, I have a magical solution to that problem," said the wizard. The abbot brought his glass, and the wizard spoke a spell from the little book he carried, and then there were two. Josephine was a little unhappy at the prospect of half a day galloping, but the abbot found her a very reliable horse to ride, and after a short conversation between Josephine and the horse, she felt much better, and off they went on the road to Wizard Hadrian's tower, as it was a little easier. They arrived just after noon. Where the tower had been, there was a circle of grass and wild flowers. Standing at its border, Josephine could feel the prickly feeling of magic all across it, and the sheep grazing nearby were clearly keeping well away from it. "Is there anything there?" asked the abbot. "A great deal of magic. We need to look very carefully all across this circle. Well, I have a lot of experience searching for wildflowers. Where should we start?" "Probably at the centre, but treading carefully. We don't want to squash a wizard." They set off, looking where they were going to place their feet at every step, so it took them a while to reach the centre. Continuing to be very careful, the abbot knelt down with his magnifying glass. At what seemed to be the very centre of the circle there was a small clump of foxgloves. The abbot examined them carefully. "I think this might be the tower transformed," whispered Josephine. The magic was crackling around them. "Ah," the abbot whispered back, "I think I've found Wizard Hadrian. I'm hoping he's asleep. He's been transformed into a dormouse." "How do you know it's him?" "He's sleeping with his paws wrapped around a tiny book." He handed the magnifying glass to the witch. She was very glad that they had found him, but she was struggling not to laugh. Peering carefully at the tiny book, she could see that it was a book of spells. The Dormouse Wizard woke up. He looked startled, then seemed to see the abbot and recognise him. "He seems to know who you are. That's a good sign. Let's take him back to St. Michael's. We can at least keep him safe while everyone works out what to do. Let's hope Wizard Alaric has found Wizard Selwyn." Josephine picked up the Dormouse Wizard very carefully. He struggled and squeaked in protest, but calmed down when he realised no one was going to separate him from his book of spells. He travelled back to the monastery in the pocket of the witch's coat, with some grass for bedding. By nightfall they were back at the monastery. Wizard Alaric had indeed found Selwyn in the shape of a green lizard hiding under another clump of tall flowers, though he did not know what they were called. The lizard wizard, that also made Josephine want to laugh, had also still got his miniature book of spells. Wizard Alaric explained that all wizards surround their book of spells with powerful protections, so that they were still in their own shape, even if tiny. "Well, we found the wizards in their books," the abbot said to Wizard Alaric. "So what do we do now?" "I have no idea," said the wizard, shrugging. "Well, let's make them comfortable and get a good night's sleep," said Josephine. "I'm not built for so much horse riding." The wizard looked for a moment as if he were going to disagree with her, but in the end he shrugged again. "Maybe Mistress Josephine has a point. I could do with the rest myself. Maybe a solution will present itself in the morning." Back in her cottage, Mistress Josephine found some embrocation for her sore muscles, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat and thought. Like most witches, she was a great storyteller, and was already rehearsing to herself the story of the sea serpent and the two wizards, even though only one part of the story had any kind of conclusion. That led her to think of the other witches' tales. She was beginning to drift into a doze when she remembered a particular story. It was a favourite Christmas story, a snippet of the story for every one of the O antiphons at the end of Advent. It was a story of a wizard who had accidentally transformed himself into a worm. Of course, there were two wizards here accidentally transformed. By the time she got herself ready for bed, she had an idea. But could she persuade Wizard Alaric to listen to a witch's tale? She arrived at the monastery the next morning with cake, a sponge cake would be a different story. A sponge cake filled with homemade strawberry jam and clotted cream. The wizard and the abbot were sitting in the abbot's parlour looking glum. The wizard was leafing through his small spell book. She did not mention her idea until after everyone had drunk a cup of rosehip tea and eaten a slice of cake. It was a very good cake. As they each took a second slice, she took a deep breath. "May I offer a story? We witches don't write our magic in books of spells. There is wisdom to be found in the stories we tell." "I thought witches' stories were mainly about the stupidity of witches," said Wizard Alaric dryly. "Well, even if that is true, those two wizards seem to have behaved rather foolishly, so maybe this tale has something to offer," Josephine said carefully. "I think we should listen," said the abbot between mouthfuls of sponge cake. "You may well be right," said the wizard reluctantly. So Josephine told them the story of the witch and the worm. She did not tell it as she would have to the villagers before Christmas, but she was a storyteller, and told it well. Then the witch took a deep breath and sang her own little spell, "Wizard, awaken and see what thou hast done to thee." It was a tiny spell which curled around and into the worm's ruby eyes like a wisp of frankincense. She dared do no more. Now it was up to the wizard himself. She realised the villagers were all standing at the foot of the hill. She hoped they would come no nearer. Mixing different kinds of magic could sometimes have an explosive effect. At first she thought that nothing was happening at all, but very gradually she saw that the worm's eyes were beginning to glow like a lantern. Brighter and brighter they glowed, like red-hot charcoal. This was not her magic, too bright and showy. Suddenly, red beams of light shot from the worm's eyes. They hit the mirror and bounced onto the book of spells. For a moment she was worried that the book would catch fire, but then she heard a voice, not in the outer world but in her head. It must be the wizard's thoughts, but they made no sense. Had being turned into a worm scrambled his brain entirely? Then she realised that the words were like mirror words, backwards. Originally he had spoken the spell to himself and set it go by seeing himself in the mirror. Now he was seeing himself in the mirror and speaking the spell backwards. Wizard Hadrian and Wizard Selwyn are not in human form, she said, but they do have their book of spells. They would not need a mirror. But we need a spell to get them going, said the wizard slowly. Not necessarily mine, said Josephine diplomatically. Actually, said the wizard, thinking about it, why, wizard's magic might mix in with a monstrous spell and make it worse. Well, we don't want you turning into a dormouse, do we? Said Josephine. Would you like some more cake? Reluctantly, but with a little good grace, they decided that Mistress Josephine would sing a spell over the two transformed wizards. Mistress Josephine let Wizard Alaric and the abbot get the transformed wizards to let go of their books of spells, so that with the use of the abbot's magnifying glass they could find the spells of transformation in each of the wizards' books. It took a while. The dormouse and the lizard were each put in a box with their own books of spells, carefully opened at the correct page. When Wizard Alaric and the abbot looked at Mistress Josephine, she took a deep breath while sending up a silent prayer that this would work, and said, "Wizards awake, the serpent has gone. Undo your magic and take back your spells. Restore what you were and your towers so tall." She made her spell as small as she could and made a tiny gesture with the index finger on her right hand. The lizard and the dormouse looked up at her as if they had heard her, and she saw her magic like two wisps of smoke uncurl from one another and into their tiny eyes, which flashed with understanding. Then the tiny creatures turned to their books of spells, and Josephine heard strange voices, which she gradually realised were the inner voices of the two wizards, reading backwards the spells they had made. At this moment Josephine thought it sensible to step back as, with a bang, a cloud of oily green smoke full of tiny black numbers billowed out from the dormouse and the lizard and began to fill up the room. She recognised it as the monstrous spell that she had seen while scrying in her copper mirror. "I think it might be sensible to leave the room," said Wizard Alaric, and the three of them backed through the door. They left the door open and watched as the numbers and the green smoke gradually separated. The numbers hovered for a moment over the dormouse and the green smoke over the lizard, then each descended. There were two more loud reports. Josephine thought it was sensible to retreat even further, as the dormouse and the lizard were quite suddenly transformed into two naked wizards. Josephine returned to her cottage, while the abbot sent more messengers to the sites of the wizards' towers, who reported at the end of the day that they had indeed returned to normal. She thought it would be sensible to keep out of the way, as the wizards would have been so embarrassed at the thought of being helped by a witch. However, just as she was going to retire to bed, there was a knock on the door, and there were the three wizards, Alaric and Hadrian and Selwyn, who had borrowed monks' habits until they could get back to their towers and find their own robes. They had brought her a big bunch of flowers. She invited them in and made them each a cup of chamomile tea. As she pottered around, she could see the three wizards looking about. She showed them her copper scrying mirror, and they said thank you for her help. She never became a good friend of either Hadrian Delancey or Selwyn Prothero, but they were always very polite when they met at events in the monastery, and were indeed polite to one another. She did become a friend of Wizard Alaric. He would come to tea every now and again, and she would always make a sponge cake, and they would discuss what was going on in the area. She discovered that he brewed particularly fine beer. They even visited the cove where the sea serpent had laid her eggs, and saw the baby serpents hatch. The end. And as I said, that was the last story in book 1, The Witches of Old Albion. But fear not, because, well, a second will I just vanish. I've got book 2 right here. So I'm going to plough on with that. Please do come and join me. Thank you.